What's the next witness?
Next witness will be Pastor Smith.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is a little bit like the 1950s when your mother was still home, so you went home for lunch as a break in school, and you came back all energized, ready for those final 2 classes before you went out into the schoolyard. So we thank you all for being here. And do you have Mr. Lane's place? Mr. Lane. Please give me Mr. Lane. Okay, good. Our next witness is Lee Lane, who is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is co-director for AEI's project on climate engineering. Mr. Lane was previously a consultant to Charles River Associates International, where he produced analysis of climate and energy issues. Welcome, Mr. Lane. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you very much, Chairman Markey. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to discuss with you a piece of legislation that's obviously quite ambitious and important. I refer, of course, to the American Clean Energy and Security Act. The draft bill is an ambitious effort to grapple with what I believe is a very serious challenge posed by rising levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. With climate change, though, there are no easy solutions, and many purported solutions are actually likely to amount to costly errors. If enacted, this legislation would work far-reaching changes on the American economy, yet the bill's approach appears to be based on assumptions that clash with what I think are 4 basic realities of current climate policy. And my statement focuses on these, and let me just summarize them briefly, if I may. First, the costs of the proposed emissions cutbacks would very probably exceed their benefits. Rapid emission cuts, like those called for in the bill's cap-and-trade provisions, will lead to needlessly high costs. Furthermore, the draft bill's regulatory mandates are likely to raise costs without adding benefits. You heard some allusions to the problem of a duplicative system this morning in some of the testimony from the first panel. I suspect that this is potentially a serious problem. Secondly, deep unilateral U.S. emissions cuts will not improve the prospects for reaching an effective global accord and may actually harm them. I suspect this is a place where there are some disagreements on the panel, but I think it's an issue worth discussing. Greenhouse gas control as an issue is 85% about striking a global bargain. It's only about 15% a matter of domestic energy and emissions control policy. Enacting this bill in its current form would amount to giving away America's biggest stack of bargaining chips, its willingness to incur costs in domestic greenhouse gas controls. And it would amount to giving it away for free, and before the serious bargaining has really even begun. The U.S. has not used this kind of strategy in its bargains on trade negotiations or arms controls or other important negotiations, and I think for very good reasons. Third, with the legislation or without it, the conditions that would be required to reach an effective global greenhouse gas control accord are in fact absent. For many key nations, the costs of a greenhouse gas control agreement exceed its perceived benefits. Globally, the benefits are both very unevenly distributed and highly uncertain. These same factors have defeated previous attempts to reach agreement. My greatest fear is that this bill could become a step toward another agreement that is, like the Kyoto Protocol, both costly and ineffectual. Fourth, the U.S. can and should take action on climate change. My answer to Mr. Inslee's question earlier today is that, yes, I take climate change quite seriously. But realism about climate change demands a serious but patient approach to greenhouse gas curbs, a combination of gradual emissions cuts, basic science research, and adaptation can, I think, protect U.S. national interests without incurring excessive costs and without causing undue conflict with other global powers like China, India, Japan, and Russia. Some features of the draft bill reflect what I believe are valuable insights. For example, I believe that it is right to stress adaptation and the need to advance technology. These are crucial aspects of climate policy. In these areas, my statement offers a few suggestions about how its efforts, the bill's efforts, in these directions might be made more cost-effective. I hope those suggestions are useful and that as the bill evolves, it does so in ways that will increase its benefits and decrease its costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lane, very much. Our next witness is the Reverend Douglas Smith. He is the Executive Director of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. He was formerly on the staff of the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, members of the committee. I'm Doug Smith.
Could you move the microphone in a little bit closer, please?
I'm Doug Smith, the Executive Director of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, an organization that seeks to address hunger, poverty, and the care for God's creation through the development and adoption of sound policy. While the faith community is so diverse that no one can really claim to represent it completely, I would like to share with you the perspective of many of us, including the National Council of Churches and a number of our ecumenical and interfaith organizations. First and foremost, we applaud the inclusion of strong international adaptation assistance measures in the draft of the American Clean Energy and Security Act. We see this as a necessary component of any U.S. legislation, particularly as we work to ensure strong and robust responses to a post-Kyoto agreement. I would like to speak to the importance of this section as understood by the faith community. We must ensure that generations know that we acted in good faith to protect all people from the impact of global climate change. Because of the interconnectedness of God's creation, we share not only the need to provide adaptation funding for developing countries, but also the responsibility as people of good conscience and, for many of us, of common faith. Our best scientists and global security analysts tell us that climate change will impact hunger, poverty, and war very nearly. By the middle of this century, 1 billion people will likely face significant water shortages. And with 75% of persons in developing countries subsisting on agriculture, they can be assured of a famine-filled future. And sadly, we can be assured of an unstable geopolitical future if we do not act with boldness, act with compassion, and act with immediacy. In the faith-based NGO community, we are already witnessing how climate change is complicating our capacity to serve others internationally. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Virginia Interfaith Center recently sent one of my staff to Nicaragua. Mr. Wren tells the story of Santa Marta, an ancient East Coast indigenous Mosquito community whose language has never needed a word for hurricane. And yet in 2007, Felix, a Category 5 hurricane, practically wiped Santa Marta off of the map. As weather patterns shift as a result of global climate change, people like the citizens of Santa Marta are struggling to adapt to emerging realities for which they are unprepared. This is why it's so important that we provide adaptation funding to developing countries. It's because the international consequences of global climate change are already today impacting millions of people, and that leads the faith community to be united and our call to provide for international adaptation assistance to protect the most vulnerable communities around the world. We urge the committee to support the language included in the American Clean Energy and Security Act, but we do ask for the following legislative priorities to find their way into any final bill. Number one, the funds should be appropriately targeted in terms of recipient countries. They should go to the most vulnerable developing countries, and no more than 10% should go annually to any one country. Two, local communities must be engaged in a participatory process with adequate monitoring, evaluation, and transparency. Number three, the funds provided should be in addition to current funding levels of official development assistance. Number four, the funds should be appropriately targeting adaptation around climate impacts, around drought, natural disasters, disease, and migration. And number five, legislation should also enhance developing country efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing deforestation, encouraging reforestation, and by transitioning to cleaner energy technologies. We in the U.S. have a moral responsibility to those in need during this global crisis. I would say that loving our neighbors includes equipping them to protect themselves from climate change. And I'd like to ask you today to commit to providing substantial financial support annually of no less than $7 billion per year. That is the minimum that we should be able to do for those in desperate need. I thank you for this opportunity to testify on these important matters and for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Reverend, very much. The Chair now turns to recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. McMacken. Mike Doyle and I have been working on an effort to provide some security against job leakage for some time. We introduced our bill in October, and it's just been the last week or two we've heard about concerns from oil refineries, which surprises me, frankly, that this is now arising. Had the oil refinery folks attempted to join your coalition or asked to be involved in your efforts?
No, Mr. Inslee. In some ways, I guess I'm not surprised, in that it's always been seen as a unique case. The witness from ConocoPhillips yesterday, I think, said it right. There were two studies. Those two studies may be outdated, but they indicated that the oil industry might be able to pass along these costs, unlike the other energy-intensive industries in our coalition. I do think it's a special case, and it ought to be treated specially, different than the provision for the energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries.
I think there's good cause to believe they are in a different situation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't think about that with particularly small refiners, but I think there is a different case. I want to ask Dr. Hauser about this. You've written a book about this, and I think that there's a concern about treating them the same where they are different. Do you think that petroleum refineries are different from other energy-intensive manufacturing industries from a job leakage perspective?
Sure. Thank you very much. First, I'd say in our analysis of the criteria as you've laid it out in the Inslee-Doyle provision, refineries do not qualify under either the energy intensity or the carbon intensity metric. So in our assessment, the energy cost as a share of shipment value for refineries is about 2.5%, and the cutoff line is 5%. At 2.5%, there's a lot of other industries that no one would think of as being energy intensive that are at that same line. The refineries have suggested that we look at still gas, which is not included in the purchase value in the surveys that are outlined in the Inslee-Doyle provision. We did that, and even including a fairly high price assumption for still gas does not put refineries over the threshold to qualify. As Mr. McMacken said, the empirical studies that have been done in Europe ex post, looking at the impact of phase 2 of the EU emissions trading scheme on refineries, found no evidence of leakage there. I guess the additional point that I would make is that the output-based nature of the rebating program that you've developed with Representative Doyle is to try to ensure that these goods that we need for a low-carbon future, like steel and glass, can still be manufactured here in the U.S. the goal of climate policy is to move away from fossil fuels. And so we don't want an output-tied allowance for fossil fuels. It goes against the goal of the program.
So in bottom line, even though we are all justifiably concerned about job leakage at any sector of our economy, you think there's a significant reason to distinguish the oil refineries from the energy-intensive manufacturers. Is that a fair
I think
statement?
that's right. And there may be legitimate competitiveness concerns that refineries face. I think that if they can demonstrate that, it should be dealt with under a separate provision, not the output-based rebating provision.
Right, and I think, I would suggest that if those special provisions have specific proposals, we hope they'll come forward. Actually, there's an ad hoc coalition for small business refiners that have made a proposal. We're happy to look at these proposals, but I think it's going to be a unique case that would require a specific criteria in that regard. So we'll be looking forward to any suggestions in this regard. I want to appreciate Reverend Smith's comments. Reverend, just from a non-ecumenical standpoint, is there any faith that you're aware of, from Buddhist to Hindu to Baptist to Catholic, for the full spectrum of human faith, is there any faith that you think non-action dealing with climate change would be really consistent with the sort of stewardship views of those faiths?
Mr. Inslee, I would say that I'm unaware of any faith community who would not want action taken to protect the one earth that we have. And I'm aware of only concern within the faith community about climate change.
So this is one that, by taking action, fair to say we might unite all the Creator's children on this one. Is that about a fair statement?
It's a fair statement.
We hope to do that. That'll be another good reason to pass this bill. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, sir. We were engaged in a brief conversation. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Appleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for not being here for the testimony of all the witnesses. I do have a couple of questions, and hopefully the time won't expire before I'm done. Mr. Conway, I have 2 nuclear plants in my district, and we're hoping to add some reactors, thus adding jobs in the future. And it's my understanding that the steelworkers are very supportive of additional nuclear across the country. And as you know, our energy needs are going to grow by about 30 to 40% by the year 2030. Nuclear has no greenhouse gas emissions, thousands of jobs. When my 2 plants were built, 85% of the components came from within the United States. Today, they're looking at a new plant in Congressman Dingell's district at the Fermi plant on the other side of the state from where I live. If they're successful in getting that reactor approved by the NRC, it's likely that 85% of the components are going to come from someplace else other than the United States. They're currently repairing a steel turbine at one of my facilities, 500 some jobs while they're repairing it. It was made in Germany. Would the steelworkers support this bill? As you may know, has nothing on nuclear in it. Would the steelworkers support adding a title to try and streamline the process to bring back nuclear in maybe a little faster way than not, knowing that it will add lots of jobs?
No, as you know, we have workers in that industry and work hard on their behalf as well as everyone else, and we don't believe that a comprehensive energy policy going forward excludes nuclear, and like everyone else, I guess we struggle with storage and issues like that, but we're not naive about that. So we would support anything that does that. More importantly, your discussion about the supply chain that centers around that facility and the manufacturing facilities that are around it and located to it, we think that's been lacking in a lot of the discussion in creating a renewable sector in this country, and that the country hasn't built out a manufacturing supply chain. So we would welcome it and would be glad to work with you on that.
As much as I'd like to see the issue of the disposal of high-level nuclear waste addressed in this bill, I confess that That's not a
understand
doable
it.
thing. But we can, in fact, streamline the process, and I think switch the light from red to green, and your support would be helpful. And I think that it would be strongly bipartisan as we embark on that issue. I don't know if you saw last week's Washington Post, but there was a headline, India rejects calls for emission cuts. Officials say growth will be compromised. It goes on to say, no way, that they're not going to participate. I know that it's in the interest of a number of members. I believe Mr. Inslee and Mr. Doyle have an amendment that is going to be part of this that calls for a border adjustment so that we would, in essence, be able to have a tax on imported goods, steel as an example, from countries that don't have a cap-and-trade program. If, however, the WTO rules that that is not compliant, would the steelworkers support an off-ramp or, in essence, the jettison of that provision?
Look, we believe it is compliant with the WTO provisions, and I guess we would cross that bridge when we get to it. But we think that a border adjustability doesn't come into play if you're going to make your product the right way. And so the way we view it, it's sort of like severance pay. You ask a company for severance pay. If they're going to fight about it, they intend to lay off some people. If people are going to fight about border adjustability, you have to sort of worry about what their intents are going to be and the way they intend to make it. Right now, we face steel expansion in China for 500 million tons over the last decade. And if you think about it, it is the newest steel production that's gone on in the planet, but still China emits a 2.5, 3 times U.S. steel industry. So it's easy to deduce that the best of statements may not match up with intentions. And one way to make sure that people are honest in a time of growth in nations like China and India is that there is a border adjustability, and if you make it the right way and you make it clean, you don't have to worry about it. But if you don't, you would pay for it as if you had.
But if
And
they
we would
rule
not
that's
look at
out,
jettisoning it.
and Susan Schwab sent a letter last year, our committee, saying that she did not think it was going to be WTO compliant. So if let's say the jury's out today, you've got evidence on both sides, but ultimately if they say thumbs down,
Well, look,
And-
we're not particularly thrilled with everything the WTO says anyway, so
Yeah,
I
know.
I would not look to positive position on that
Yeah.
until we hear from them.
all right, I know my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I
We've
appreciate
run out of Ds. Can you believe that?
I didn't realize you'd already gone, so
Yes.
my apologies.
Right.
And that's fine with me if you've run out of Ds. We could do that more often, maybe when we vote. No, I'm just kidding. Let's see, Mr. Lane. Yeah, it's on my
Major
5
parliamentary
minutes.
inquiry.
Is it possible now to call up the bill? We can dispense with it real quick. We can all catch our planes going home today and not worry about being
I'm
here
staying for tomorrow. I'm reclaiming my time. Mr. Lane, would border tariffs and other trade measures motivate China to go along and impose stiff emission cuts?
Sir, I don't believe that they will, nor do I think the prospect of an updating subsidy provision will have that effect. I think there's every reason for thinking that China and India will continue to resist imposing on their economies the cost of significant restrictions on greenhouse gases. And frankly, I don't believe that there's anything that the United States and its government is able to do that will change at reasonable cost to us, to ourselves,
Right.
that will change their attitudes on that point.
And do you think they're big enough and capable enough they'd just pay the tariffs anyway and move on?
They probably wouldn't even have to. My own assessment would be that they would simply increase their exports to countries like Japan
And work around,
and change the geographic pattern of trade flows rather than actually reducing their exports.
So your
at
point
all.
is that these countries who don't participate in a cap-and-trade scheme could get very creative and work around the tariffs anyway?
Yes, very easily.
Putting our workers at disadvantage,
I believe so.
costing us manufacturing jobs.
And eliminating most of the point of greenhouse gas controls, because if they don't
They're actually
control-
worse, aren't they? Is it true that China's building 2 coal-fired plants basically a week
I have
right now?
heard numerous figures, and I don't know whether it's 1, 2, or more, but they are clearly rapidly increasing their coal-fired electric capacity.
And I'm going to ask this panel like I have, I think every other panel that's been here. Have you all read the bill? Simple yes or no. Mr. Lane, Reverend Smith,
Not in its entirety, no, sir.
Mr. Durin,
Not in its entirety.
Dr. Hauser.
Same answer.
You're a good man. Mr. Conway,
No, not entirely.
Mr. Wells,
Not in its entirety, no, sir.
sir?
All of the cap and trade title, not all.
No, I'm talking about the whole bill.
No, sir.
Then I guess I would ask you a question on page 527 of the bill. They've inserted a private right of action so that any individual can sue anybody for enforcement, even for fairly de minimis additions of carbon. And I'm going to flip to that real quick because I want to know whether you support that provision of the bill, because they define a harm that would include any effect of air pollution, including climate change currently occurring or at risk of occurring, and the incremental exacerbation of any such effect or risk that's associated with a small incremental emission of any air pollutant. And then it goes on from there, and the person would only have to say they might be affected in the future. Do you support that private right of action in this legislation? Mr. McMacken?
Yes, Congressman, our group is focused solely on perfecting the anti-leakage provisions, but I probably wouldn't be going too far out on a limb to say that we would have considerable problems with a private right of action that's that robust.
Mr. Wells, yes or no?
As you've described it, no, we would not support
Mr.
that.
Conway?
No, I would need to read it more and understand it.
Got it. Dr. Hauser?
I need to review the provision.
Dr. Duringer, or Mr. Duringer,
I
sorry.
understand this is similar to standard provision, and many environmental statutes have played an important role in the enforcement of those statutes over the years.
So you would support it?
I would have to look at this precise
All right.
language.
Reverend Smith?
I'm not familiar with the language.
All right. Mr. Lane?
Let me withhold final judgment while saying I'm extremely skeptical about anything that has so much potential for generating litigation.
All right, I appreciate that. I want to go on to one of my favorite topics, which is hydropower. I represent a district that has lots of dams along the Columbia River and gets most of its power, a good percentage of it at least, from the hydro system. And Mr. Conway, I know steelworkers used to have aluminum plants in my district, or there were aluminum plants that had many of your members that relied very much on that hydropower for the production of aluminum. Those plants now are closed and gone. Does anybody on this panel think hydropower should not be considered as a renewable energy source? Mr. Lane? Reverend Smith? Mr. Duringer? Dr. Hauser? Mr. Conway?
No.
Mr. Wells?
No.
Mr. McMacken. So you all believe hydro should be considered as renewable? Okay, good. Now, Mr. Wells, Dow Chemical, I want to ask you this question. If I vote and we enact a cap-and-trade system, which necessarily raises energy costs, everybody else has testified that it will your company guarantee me you won't chase cheaper energy for your manufacturing offshore?
If the competitive provisions I testified to are included in the cap and trade, and energy prices for trade-exposed and energy-intensive manufacturers stay competitive, no, we will not. We will go where the energy is competitive. And as the
So
provision...
you will go where the energy is competitive, and China and India would not be involved. Are you saying China and India have to be involved in this same scheme?
For this bill to make sense for a trade-exposed and energy-intensive manufacturer, we would have to have those provisions that allows us to stay competitive from an energy perspective with them.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time the chair recognizes the chairman emeritus of the full committee, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you for your courtesy. I'd like to continue on the questions my colleague just finished. Going across, starting at your right and my left, if you please, gentlemen. Yes or no? Are you content with the provisions of the bill that deal with countries such as India or China, which do not have a cap of their own? Yes or no, please?
No.
Sir?
I believe the United States needs to be a leader.
I'm sorry?
I believe the United States needs to be a leader in this realm.
So you think it's good that they should not have a cap and we should?
No, Mr. Chair, and that's not at all what I said. I think that the United States should be a leader and
Just yes or no? I don't want a lot of toe dancing. Just, do you think that, are you content with the provisions that deal with the United States but don't deal with India and China?
I am, yes, sir.
You are. And you, sir?
Yes.
And you?
I think they come pretty close.
And you, sir?
No, not entirely.
Why?
We think there's a transition period where our industries who have to come up to speed ought to be rebated the full cost of compliance for a period of time and then go to an average sector. And so we think eventually it's there, but there's an initial time period where we need to phase in and protect the jobs that we have.
Next panel member, please, sir.
We're supportive of, again, as a transition, that it protects those industries that would be in competition with those places that do not have a cap.
And after the competition?
Excuse me?
And after that time?
If the transition, those protections would have to stay in place until places like China, India would have a similar situation.
Do you know that, or do you just hope?
Through working with people like Mr. McMacken, we're comfortable with that, yes.
And you, sir? Our next panel member, please. Are you satisfied with the provisions that deal with countries such as India and China, which may or may not have a cap of their own? Yes or no?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Our group has been focused exclusively on perfecting the anti-leakage provisions to the extent possible. We believe those have to be a bridge to an agreement that leads to a situation where we have equalized costs with foreign producers.
Thank you. Now, going across the same direction again, yes or no? Is there any more that you would like to see in terms of protections for American industry included in the legislation? Yes or no, if you please?
My answer would be yes, principally in the form of controls on the overall costs of the bill.
And you, sir?
I would say, sir, that I'm not familiar with those provisions within the bill because I'm here specifically to speak about international adaptation.
Thank you. And you, sir?
I'd like to reserve judgment as I focus particularly on the bill's relation to international negotiations, and there may be other aspects of the bill with respect to your question that I would want to look at.
Next panelist.
I feel like the phase-out portion of the bill could use a little bit more clarification.
And again, sir?
We think it needs a border adjustability provision at its onset and remains in place during the life of the understandings.
Thank you. Next panelist.
Yeah, we would like to see the feedstock exemption for the chemical industry perfected a bit more.
And you, sir?
And Mr. Chairman, we think the leakage provision needs strengthened, and some of the other provisions, as Dow has testified, like the non-emissive provisions, need better definition.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I happen to think that Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee have done a good job of directing their attention to protecting trade-exposed industries in this legislation. Do you feel that the draft bill does an adequate job of protecting those industries? Starting again, if you please, sir, on your far right.
I would say that it probably does a better job of protecting those industries than it does of leveling the playing field for the U.S. economy as a whole.
Next panelist, please.
I would say, sir, that that's not my specialty within the bill. So I
Thank you.
reserve
Next panelist.
We're very comfortable with the general framework laid out in the bill.
Next panelist.
Yes.
Next panelist.
Not quite. We think it's close. It needs some more refinement, as we discussed earlier on the border adjustability and the 100% rebate on compliance.
And our next panelist.
As long as the protection stays in place until such time as there's an international level playing field, yes, we're comfortable.
It's an excellent structure, Mr. Chairman. A lot will depend on whether it's adequately funded with allowances. We think that would require between 850 and 900 million allowances a year.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you've been very courteous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, the chair is going to recognize a member of the full committee. She is not a member of the subcommittee, but certainly she's welcome and recognized at this time for 5 minutes, the gentlelady from Tennessee. Is that right?
We're done?
I see. The members of the subcommittee will obviously have priority. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
I got everything that you said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard some testimony from a few of you about operations you have in other countries. I think, Mr. Wells, you talked about maybe 50% of Dow Chemicals workforce is out of the country. What are some of the factors in deciding whether or not you're going to build a plant or expand a plant in the United States versus going to another country?
Certainly the implications of the cost of the region, and for us, a large part of that is energy, as I've testified today and testified in front of this group before. And then certainly the closeness to the market. Where's the market developing? When you apply those two things together, when you look at what's happened to our industry, the U.S. chemical industry, over the last, let's say, 8 years, and you look at what energy prices have done, natural gas from 2002 to 2008 has gone up by nearly 500%. Chemical industry has gone from being very positive from a trade perspective, one of the highest in the country, to now we have a trade deficit.
And so what are some of those other costs? What are some of the top countries that you go to when Dow goes to another country as opposed to here?
It's certainly the Middle East, where we can get our feedstocks, which are byproducts of the energy process, natural gas, byproducts of oil. So the Middle East is where we can get low cost. And then, of course, we are moving into the expanding markets, so places like China, India.
Mm-hmm. Do any of those countries that you just mentioned, do any of those have any kind of cap policy on greenhouse gases, specifically carbon?
None of the ones that I mentioned, no.
And so, you know, some of us look at the bill, and of course there are a lot of details that are left out, but one of the things, if we go back to President Obama's actual budget that was passed by the House just a few weeks ago, his budget envisions raising about $640 billion from a cap-and-trade energy tax. So clearly, whether or not the details are in the bill, and of course many of the details are not, on how this whole trading mechanism would work and who would get these free allowances, ultimately the President's own budget says that they've got to come up with some kind of mechanism that raises $646 billion in new taxes, in essence. And so if a bill is going to come out of this committee, I hope a bill like the one presented does not. As I talked about earlier, the American Energy Act is a true alternative bill that we've proposed for a comprehensive national energy policy that will fund the alternative sources of energy, create those new jobs, while also not running off the existing jobs we have, and encouraging things like clean coal, encouraging more nuclear power, which emits no carbon. And so there is another alternative out there, but the bill that we're discussing today clearly has a big cost, $646 billion. How would a company like Dow react if these new conditions come on and you're not given the allowances you think you might be getting, and then you've got to make a business decision, as you have in the past, to keep those jobs in the United States or to move them to one of the countries that doesn't emit or that doesn't control emissions? Ultimately, have y'all started making any of those decisions, or are you waiting for this bill to come out to see what you're going to do?
If a bill that comes out does not look at such things as carbon leakage, doesn't handle such thing as carbon leakage, the feedstock exemption is extremely important to the U.S. chemical industry, and then avoiding the dash to gas, as we've talked about many times. If a bill does not have those things, and it's safe to say what you've seen happen because of the rising energy prices over the last decade would continue to happen and be exacerbated by the climate change bill.
Thanks. And Mr. Conway, in relation to the steel workers, I'm familiar with a steel plant that is proposed to be built. Right now it's proposed to be built in the United States, in fact in South Louisiana, but they're looking at two sites. They're looking at the United States, the South Louisiana facility, or Brazil. And they've made it clear now, a few months ago, they pulled back on any decisions until they see what happens with cap and trade energy tax bill. And they said if this bill passes, they're going to build that plant, but they're going to build it in Brazil. And we're talking about a $2 billion investment, 700 good jobs, steel workers, that would be created, and they will be created. And the question is, will they be created in the United States, which has environmental controls already in place that are much better than Brazil, or will it be built in Brazil where they will not have the same controls? And in fact, if somebody's concerned about carbon emissions, more carbon will be emitted if that plant is built in Brazil. Yet passage of this bill will dictate whether or not those 700 jobs and the $2 billion investment go to Brazil. Do you, when you're looking at that, especially as your workforce issues are going to become more concerned by legislation like this that would run some of these companies off, what are your thoughts on how that would affect employees in your industry?
Congressman, we think there's much of that going on anyway. And if, in fact, the purpose of the bill is to try and reduce carbon on a global basis, we understand that this leads to a global sectoral agreement where people across the world agree on what emissions ought to be in a sector.
Well, of course,
Brazil ought to set
countries like Brazil, and we've heard earlier China and India will not comply.
A company, a German company who's moving into Alabama, who intends to put up half a steel plant because it intends to run the other half of the plant in Brazil, where it can emit a lot of carbon, and it will import slabs into here. That doesn't solve the carbon problem, and if what we're here to do is try and solve the problem of carbon emissions, then we need that global sectoral agreement. And our position is simply, until we reach it, we ought to treat the steel made in Brazil as if it were made the right way and the clean way. And
Right.
that's what the
And of
Board
course, we know it's not, and those remedies are not in this bill, unfortunately. So
Well,
I appreciate your
Gentleman's time
testimony. I
has
yield my
expired.
time.
Thank you. At this time, the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. Let me just take a moment to join my colleagues who have been discussing this today and say that I agree that it is critical that we must protect our industry and manufacturing base in this legislation. Without question, we must do that. And so I want to go on record publicly thanking my colleagues Jay Inslee and Mike Doyle for their hard work in developing a plan and to make sure that these jobs stay right here in America. In my district down in the eastern part of North Carolina, there are a number of different energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, such as Nucor Steel, which is in a small town named Winton, North Carolina. That industry employs nearly 500 people, good-paying jobs, produces 2.8 million tons of steel plate from recycled scrap each year. These are the kinds of jobs that we can ill afford to lose in a district where 21 of 23 counties have more than double-digit employment. And so I want to thank these two gentlemen for their work, as well as the other members of the committee. I also want to thank all of you for your testimony today. Specifically, I want to address this to Mr. Mackin. Do I understand from your testimony, sir, both your testimony today and back in March, that you think that allocating 15% of allowances should be sufficient to support the eligible trade-exposed industries?
Yes, Congressman, with this footnote. That 15%, which was the same number that was in the original Inslee-Doyle bill, same number that, by the way, was over in the Senate in the Brown-Stabenow amendment, was based upon the number of allocations in the Lieberman-Warner bill, about $5.7 billion. The annual allocations in this bill are a little lower, so actually I think the math comes out to about 16%.
I understand that you believe that the problem at hand can adequately be solved with using free allocation to eligible trade-exposed industries, and that, as you write in your testimony, the draft has adopted a structure that can really work. Is this correct?
That's right, Congressman.
Let me now speak briefly to Pastor Smith. Thank you for your testimony and for your work in general. Thank you so very much. Can you, Pastor, briefly paint a picture for us about how money to a country like Zimbabwe provides security for that country as well as our country?
Yes, sir. Many of us are aware of the situation in Zimbabwe currently, where we have millions of people now that face famine. We have civil unrest in places. It's really a dangerous cocktail when you mix famine and poverty with a government which is non-democratic. When we add the issue of climate change in that, it really becomes quite difficult, because what was previously the breadbasket of Africa then creates an unstable situation continent-wide in this kind of a situation, because what ends up happening is the investments that we've made in the past in development essentially gets wiped out. And so when we create opportunities for international adaptation through funding through U.S. Congress, what we do is we ensure an investment today helps us keep countries like Zimbabwe able to continue to feed their people, able to participate in a global economic system, able to resist nefarious groups that may try to go in and co-op a very difficult situation in the country. And ultimately, it also helps to secure the investments that we've made through the NGO community and USAID in the past years in order to lift that country out of the desperate situation it finds itself.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Wells, do you concur with the 15% assessment by your colleague to the left? You think that would be sufficient?
As a member of his organization, we sure do.
Yes. So 15%, you want to go on record saying that 15%?
With the caveats that he's already talked about, yes.
All right. Well, thank you. The chair yields back the balance of his time. All right. Now we'll go to the gentlelady from Tennessee, the member of the full committee, Ms. Blackburn. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try not to take all 5 minutes. I do appreciate being recognized, and I appreciate that you all would be here. I'll tell you, it's fascinating listening to your responses. I think I'd like to hear from you on some questions after you all have had an opportunity to read the bill and weigh back in with us at that point. Dr. Hauser, I wanted just to ask you, my district, I'm in Tennessee, have a lot of rural area ag offsets that EPA would be able to structure under this bill. They'd have pretty broad discretion on structuring those ag offsets. And when we talk about competitiveness and global competitiveness, I'm curious what your opinion is on how EPA should go about handling the agricultural offsets that they'll be able to put in place. And also, if you think that the imposition of cap and trade will diminish the competitiveness of the American agricultural community.
I think it's an important point to bring up to think about how this bill impacts competitiveness more broadly, and agriculture is obviously an important sector there. Offsets, domestic agricultural offsets, are important for several reasons, primarily because they'll help reduce the cost of a bill. The EPA assessment of the Waxman-Markey bill that came out earlier this week shows that international offsets and domestic offsets will have a lot of the same cost benefits, reduce the cost of compliance for a climate bill by half. And so domestic agricultural offsets will play an important role there. To the extent that agricultural entities are not capped themselves, so they don't face direct domestic compliance costs, but are recipients of offset investments, then that agricultural industry will have a competitive advantage vis-a-vis its counterparts in other countries, because it has no direct compliance costs but is receiving some offset value.
Well, do you see this driving up the cost of our domestic food supply, of our domestic yarn and clothing supply?
The fossil fuels in the economy, the price of fossil fuels will certainly increase. The increase in the EPA economic assessment was fairly modest, but it will certainly increase. So then the question is, how quickly can we improve efficiency so that an increase in energy prices doesn't translate into an overall increase in energy costs? Dow Chemicals has spoken to how over the past 18 years they've reduced the energy intensity of a unit of production 38%. That type of improvement in agriculture and manufacturing is possible and is spurred on by a carbon price. So we can have higher energy prices and not higher energy costs. It just all comes down to efficiency.
How long do you think it takes us to get to the efficiency that would allow them to be competitive?
I think that the rate of improvement that companies like Dow and that the U.S. steel industry has demonstrated over the past decade, they've improved efficiency faster than the current bill would reduce emissions, right? So just on a business as usual trend, they're outpacing what the increase in energy price would be. So I'm optimistic that other sectors of the economy have that ability as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Great. Thank the gentlelady. Let me give each one of you 30 seconds. Tell us what you want us to know as we're putting together this legislation over the next several weeks. You got 30 seconds each. Give us your closing point that you want us to remember. We'll begin with you, Mr. Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The single point that I would emphasize is that as long as the cost of the bill is so high because of the speed of the emissions reductions, it's bound to have a negative impact on the U.S. economy.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. 30 seconds apiece. Mr. Smith, Reverend Smith, rather.
Mr. Chairman, I think the one thing that I would want to leave the committee with is the need to have very realistic numbers within the bill, specifically on international adaptation funding, and knowing that any funding we put today towards adaptation is an investment in the future. And I believe, and many in our coalition believe, that $7 billion is the very, very minimum where we need to start.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Derringer.
The prospects for agreement in Copenhagen will be greatly enhanced if Congress can provide some certainty as to the U.S. ability to help fund technology deployment and adaptation efforts internationally.
Thank you. Dr. Hauser.
That the competitiveness issues that we're talking about here today are manageable and can be dealt with affordably in the context of an economy-wide cap.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Conway.
That we would be naive to believe that the rest of the world that produces products will voluntarily reduce their carbon on their own without a border adjustability mechanism.
Thank you. Mr. Wells.
We have the ability here to do a real win-win. We can work on solving this problem at the same time maintaining the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers.
Mr. McMacken.
On the leakage problem for energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, the bill has an excellent structure by adopting the Inslee-Doyle structure. The key will be adequate funding of that provision through allowances. We think that would be about 850 to 900 million allowances a year.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McMacken. Thank you. Thank all of you. And I subscribe to Mr. Conway's philosophy here that we must act in ways that deal with human nature, even as it's reflected in other nations' behavior. And we must ensure that as we act in a way that is responsible, that we don't expose ourselves to others' actions which will be irresponsible. And we must ensure that we construct this legislation in a way that guarantees that American workers are not affected adversely, because we have not dealt with the reality of the fact that nations and human beings think the same, and the proper protections must be built in to ensure that there are no innocent victims that we are creating. So thank you so much. We will now, with the thanks to the committee, request that you remain available over the next several weeks so that we can continue to consult with you. And we will then move on to the final panel. Thank you. Can I see the headline on the final panel? The final panel is on move to a low carbon electricity capture and storage, renewables, and grid modernization issues.
I'm not saying we don't have a policy case, I'm just saying if